many countries in the West, they don't want this peace. They would like a long war with Russia so they can bleed the Russians, that is to weaken a strategic adversary. And as Zelensky used his own words, saying they want this even though it would mean the destruction of Ukraine and loss of Ukrainian lives. So he knew exactly what NATO was after, to fight Russia with Ukrainians. What will happen to Zelensky? I think the Ukrainians will eventually take care of him, hold him responsible. Even his former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, he made this argument that Zelensky would probably try to flee Ukraine at some point, but he would have to be brought back in a cage simply because of the crimes he has committed.
This is Professor Glenn Diesen. He is one of Europe's greatest insiders on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and last year authored a book entitled The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Inside this book, Professor Diesen explains the great shift in the global distribution of power. And with Donald Trump now back in the White House, changes to the world order have rapidly accelerated. Ukrainian President Zelensky is now prepared to swap Russian territory in peace negotiations, while Donald Trump has called for Russia's return to the G7, stating it was, quote, a mistake to throw them out. Even the U.S. government has changed its official stance on Ukraine, and for the first time now admits Ukraine will not return to its pre-2014 borders and that NATO expansion is no longer an option.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
In today's video, I sit down with Professor Diesen to discuss how the Ukraine war will end in 2025. But we also take this discussion much further and discuss great power politics, using Ukraine as a case study for examining how the world has shifted to a multipolar world with other superpowers like China rising and making their mark in the world. If you really want to understand what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and the future of the world order, this is the video for you. Let's begin.
Professor, I want to thank you so much for joining the show because you are one of Europe's most outspoken voices on the Russia-Ukraine war. Where are we in 2025 as we're now in early February, and what is the prospects for the future of Europe, future of Ukraine? How do you see this in your eyes?
Well, I do think that we're obviously in the end game. I think the war has gone through many stages, and this is obviously the final stage. One could be excused for being a bit confused about the direction of the war because there's been a lot of misinformation and focus on the wrong thing when people assess the development of the war. But it's been going towards a very logical conclusion for quite some time now. So what's happening now is in Ukraine, the front lines continue to collapse. They really began collapsing during the summer, and it just keeps falling apart faster and faster. So the attrition ratio is getting worse and worse. They're losing more men, more equipment. And what's happening now is because the lines have been thinned out so much, the Russians are able to begin to create cauldrons, larger and larger ones, surrounding more and more Ukrainian troops, which creates even more casualties. And we see that the cities are falling faster with less damage to the city, so it's happening much easier. So this is, I think it's coming to end. The problem is no one's really prepared for what the negotiations will look like, because as we know, the West, we have put effectively, we blocked or rejected any negotiations for 3 years. Not just negotiations, we didn't have diplomacy. We didn't even sit down with the Russians. So for this reason, I think we're in a very difficult position now where there's no good solution to this conflict. So it looks like it will be solved to a large extent on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's really interesting because last year we saw, for example, they had the Ukrainian Peace Summit, and very ironically, they didn't invite Russia to that table. So I think all of us were wondering, well, how are you going to have a peace if in a conclusion to this war if you don't include one of the major parties in the war? Obviously, this is between Russia and Ukraine. Russia should be there. Russia needs to be certainly have their opinion heard. And you're going to have to negotiate with Putin at the end of the day. I would like to know a little bit more on this because you mentioned before that, for example, Putin had called Zelensky within the first couple of days, offered to pull back if Ukraine would move to neutrality. Obviously, they did not accept. This war has been continuing going on. Are the Ukrainian people, are they going to be holding Zelensky accountable at this point. And, we've obviously seen just hundreds of thousands of lives. I mean, I've heard reports maybe even up to 1 million Ukrainian lives lost. How can the West really rationalize all of these lives and the money lost in this conflict so far?
Well, first, just say that these peace summits, they were always nonsense. It's just who has a peace summit? Not only did they not invite Russia, but the main objective was to mobilize support, military equipment for Ukraine, try to mobilize the world to isolate Russia. At this peace summit, you had the president of Poland suggesting that they should that the logical conclusion would be to break up Russia in smaller states. This is not a peace summit; it's a war summit. But this has been part of the problem we had for the past 3 years, because what the West wanted in Ukraine was a long war. And again, this isn't not even my words; these were the words of Zelensky, who, when he gave an interview back in March of 2022, when they were negotiating with the Russians, and in these negotiations was quite clear what the Russians wanted. They were close to a deal. The Russians, they said, we can't accept NATO in Ukraine, so if you restore your neutrality, we will pull our troops back. This was the compromise. Everyone recognized this. At this point, the US and the UK intervened and told Zelensky, walk away from this deal. If you walk away, we'll give you all the weapons you need to defeat the Russians.
Right.
And so this is, and in this interview he actually gave with The Economist, he even makes this point that many countries in the West, they don't want this peace. They would like a long war with Russia so they can bleed the Russians, that is to weaken a strategic adversary. And as Zelensky used his own words, saying they want this even though it would mean the destruction of Ukraine and loss of Ukrainian lives. So he knew exactly what NATO was after, to use to fight Russia with Ukrainians. And then and this is what we've been doing for 3 years. So we've been coming up with all these narratives why it's immoral to negotiate. So we say, because we say it was unprovoked, then if you negotiate with Russia, that means you're rewarding Putin, you will embolden him to do something similar in the future. So all these moral narratives, if Ukraine stops fighting, it won't be a Ukraine. All of these narratives have the same function, which means diplomacy is treasonous. And as Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said, weapons are the path to peace. So very Orwellian. So war is peace and diplomacy is treason. I agree with you, though. I think what will happen to Zelensky, I think the Ukrainians will eventually take care of him, hold him responsible. Even his former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, he made this argument that Zelensky would probably try to flee Ukraine at some point, but he would have to be brought back in a cage simply because of the crimes he has committed. All the Ukrainians who should be thrown into the war, which didn't have to. Yeah, by the way, his former advisor Arestovich also pointed out that the West did not allow Ukraine to take the peace deal in 2022, and they still don't want to let Ukraine make peace, even though they're being destroyed. So I think the Ukrainians will deal with him after this war, because he's done a lot of poor decisions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a heartbreaker. I think it's very clear that when we look at the cold hard facts, we certainly look at, from the United States, I think they have a desire to weaken Russia. And I think in the United States, I've heard from many people saying, it's a good war for us because we don't have to risk American troops, right? There's no American troops on the ground. But I find that a very immoral stance, because, we basically are not valuing the Ukrainian lives that are, being slaughtered and really put forward to this effort. But let's shift a little bit here towards Donald Trump, because I think this is a very interesting, certainly interesting election that we had in the United States. Obviously, one of Trump's big campaign promises, I'm going to end the Ukraine war, by January 20th. Obviously, that didn't happen. But, I think there is a interesting scenario here where, Putin has said that he's willing to negotiate with Trump. He wants Trump certainly involved. Trump has said, he potentially is going to bring in China, and, that, maybe have China at the negotiating table as well. What do you think in regards to Donald Trump? Is he going to be able to actually, bring this war to an end anytime in the near future?
Well, I'm guessing not in the near future. It has to be said that he gave himself a little bit more time after winning the election. He said, well, perhaps not in 24 hours. So we can do it in 100 days, or some suggested 6 months. So right. It's not really. So he walked that back a little bit. But right. He's not wrong, really, that America can end this war, because this is a war which is fought this is American war to a large extent, NATO war.
Right.
That is, there's the United States and the NATO countries that supply all the weapons, the intelligence. They're the one who have been pushing the continuation of the fight. Keep in mind that the majority of Ukrainians would like to start the negotiations. It's meanwhile, Zelensky put a decree that they're not even allowed. It's illegal to negotiate with Russia. So, so this is the long war. So it's hard to see now how they can bring this to an end. But I think the main problem is this could have been solved very easily. Back in 2022, because the source of the war was not territorial disputes. The source of the war was the destruction of the pan-European security architecture. That is, since the end of the Cold War, we had this great idea that security and stability would depend on just NATO gradually expanding closer and closer to Russian borders and bringing the military infrastructure closer and closer to the Russian border.
Right.
And this was supposed to bring peace and stability. Now, this makes no sense. But what the Russians wanted back in Istanbul in 2022 was, restore neutrality, but that didn't happen. And of course, then you had a war, and for various reasons, the Russians began to annexing 4 oblasts as the war continued, and for several reasons. One would be to get to give some guarantees to local governments who work with the Russians. And the second is also the conviction that, given that NATO said no negotiations, will continue to fight effectively to the last Ukrainian, they simply decided, well, we can't allow this territory to end up in the hands of NATO, so we will annex it. So now, of course, 3 years later, what was a conflict about neutrality and the NATO expansion has become about territorial conflicts. So what the Russians want is not just neutrality for Ukraine, but now also recognizing the loss of these territories.
Right.
Now, this is very difficult for anyone to sell. Even if Trump is all for it, he still has to sell it to his own colleagues in Washington.
Correct.
He needs some acceptance from Zelensky. He needs
acceptance from Europe, right? I mean, everyone's got to agree to that. Yeah, that's a hard ask.
Yeah. No, it's a huge ask. And again, for the Ukrainians, this is also something they would never accept, because they suffered immensely, been really devastated in this war. And now, they have to accept that they lost more than 20% of the country and hundreds of thousands of people dead.
Right.
And indeed, within this territory, it's also more than half of the natural resources of Ukraine. So it's going to be very hard for the country to even rebuild, because they lost so much wealth and infrastructure. So,
right. As best as you can predict, how will this conflict end? I mean, do you think that this is going to result in a Korea War style stalemate with no official ceasefire agreement?
No, simply because this is the greatest fear of the Russians would be that this would continue to be a long war. Keep in mind that after the NATO countries supported a coup in Ukraine in 2014, there was the predictable conflict, and then we had the Minsk peace agreement. Now, as we learned during the Minsk peace agreement, those 7 years, the West did not push for Ukraine to implement its part of the negotiations. Indeed, they armed Ukraine, and as Merkel, Hollande, the ones who negotiated this deal, later admitted, they weren't meant to implement it. It was to buy time to arm the Ukrainians. And as we learned since the sabotage of the Istanbul Agreement in 2022, for the past 3 years, NATO has put a lot of pressure into not having any negotiations and simply continuing into a long war. So this is what the Russians want an end to, because you can hear the rhetoric already in Ukraine. Many people are now calling for a very quick or immediate ceasefire so they can build fortifications, because the Russians just broke through all of Donbass. When they reach Zaporozhye now, there's no real fortifications anymore until they reach the Dnieper River. So they want ceasefire to build fortification. They have to rearm, prevent collapse. And this is what the Europeans are saying as well. Yeah, in a ceasefire, Ukraine could be rearmed. We can bring up our industrial production, rebuild the Ukrainian army. So so we can fight Russia later. Well, why would Russia accept this? The Ukrainian army is close to defeat. So they don't want a ceasefire. They demand a political settlement because they fear that NATO will continue in this long war. So I don't think a Korean-style stalemate is what the Russians would go for, especially if during this ceasefire the West would still arm Ukraine and still try to pull it into NATO's orbit.
Right.
So I think I think that's an unlikely outcome. So.
Right. Well, Glenn, I want to thank you for your insights into, the Russia-Ukraine war. Obviously, we're going to continue watching the situation, but I want to shift now to a little bit broader geopolitics, and I want to shift out over to Taiwan. Actually, you recently tweeted one of Trump's speeches where he criticizes, all of the money that's being allocated to Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Where they admittedly said, we don't even know what to do with this money. But now Trump is, pressuring Taiwan to move its factories to the United States. This is a very interesting situation, what we're seeing in Taiwan. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this kind of a broader geopolitics as we shift over. You had mentioned in your tweet that the U.S. cannot compete with China and must therefore cannibalize the industries of its allies and vassals. First the Europeans, next is Taiwan. Do you kind of see this spillover effect? I mean, expand a little bit upon your tweet and your thoughts on this.
Well, my thought is if we take a few steps backwards, what the main strategy which the United States went for, the main security strategy it had after the Cold War was that of hegemonic peace, that is global primacy. It was, again, very open about it. And the main idea would be if the US will dominate, there will be no great power rivalry because it's the only great power. And also if the US will dominate, they will also be in a position to elevate the role of liberal democratic values in the international system.
Right.
So you can say that there's some benign intentions there as well as we had dreams of global dominance. But anyways, this is what it's been very clear about, this global primacy. So often you hear when the United States speaks about threats, it's even, it says threat to U.S. primacy. So It's not that someone's threatening America, it's threatening America's ability to dominate the world. This is why they have to cut down the Chinese in size in terms of their technological development. This is why Russia can't have a significant role in Europe, even though it's the largest country in Europe. But the problem with this big strategy is that over time, you will have imperial overstretch. Resources are transferred from the core to the periphery. And if you listen to Trump, this is to some extent what he's referring to, because the US society has been exhausted to a large extent. If you look at the 90s till now, what has happened? Well, economically, in terms of society, the political system, all of it's been very much exhausted. It's not a sustainable path that it's currently on. Indeed, this is something that Musk is also saying, that we're reaching bankruptcy soon. This can't continue.
Right.
So this is what Trump is also reacting to. This liberal hegemony that doesn't work anymore. So he uses this language. He says, we've been treated unfairly. And so what do you do in this instance? First, you want to unload some of your empire, which is why now I think Trump will increasingly say, well, Ukraine is the Europeans' problems. They will also try to get out of the Middle East to some extent, instead focus on China. But also then they can get a higher return on investment of empire, that is to cannibalize a bit on the vassal states or the allies.
Right.
And this is an ability because when there's excessive security dependence, this can be converted into political and economic loyalties. And we see this in Europe, not just the destruction of Nord Stream, but even under Biden, they had also this Inflation Reduction Act in which the European economies, which were beginning to struggle because there was no more energy from the Russians, and the Americans sell it much more expensive than it is in the United States. And then they offered subsidies as well to the German industries in order to move across to the United States. So they're cannibalizing the European industries. And my point is, this is a rational thing to do. If you realize you have to scale back the empire a bit, you drop some of your commitments which you had, and you begin to to take some money back from the periphery to the core. So obviously the Europeans can be purged a bit, but also Taiwan. Taiwan has the majority of the semiconductor industry. So why not say, well, all of them have to move across back to the United States? This is a form of a Monroe Doctrine. If you can't have global primacy, restore the Monroe Doctrine. Again, this is why I think also Trump talks a lot about the Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada, just strengthen America's base at home, sort out its borders, of course, restore technological, that is a digital dominance. But I think Trump wants to adjust the country towards competition between great powers, and something has to be cut and something has to be strengthened. So I think, this is why it's been, again, I've written about this for past 10 years. And the reason why it is quite predictable, because it's nothing about the US, the nature of the country. It's just the distribution of power. Because when you have a lot of concentration of economic power in one hegemon, that hegemon has the ability to promote a very liberal international economic system, much like Britain in the 19th century, because suddenly if you have an open economic system and everyone uses your technologies, great. Your industries will be more competitive because it will be high quality, low cost. Great. Free trade means to saturate world markets. The whole world has to use the transportation corridors under the hegemon's navy, like Britain and now the United States has. Again, it's great. Under a liberal international system, everyone uses the US dollar, the payment system, the banks. So under this concentration of wealth, it's always a benefit or incentive to have a liberal economic system. Now, what happens when the hegemon is in decline is that it needs to use this administrative control over the international economy to prevent the rise of rivals, which is why you see, again, it was predictable to go after the Chinese tech industry, to try to cut down the Russians, to sever their energy exports to the Europeans. And at the same time, if the US can't compete properly with China, cannibalize a bit of your allies as well. I think it's a rational strategy. So again, I thought it was predictable.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm glad you brought up the Monroe Doctrine. And, for those of you that are not familiar with that, that was a foreign policy statement made by President James Monroe back in 1823, literally saying that, Latin America is America's backyard, and that hemisphere will be subject to American domination, and that no other powers, could have influence in the area. It's quite interesting to see Donald Trump move towards that. I'm glad you highlighted that. Obviously, Greenland, very close to you there in Scandinavia. Obviously, very close relationship with Denmark. I think there's a very interesting thing going on. Like, what are your thoughts on that? On these statements from Donald Trump, how do you look at that as a European, more specifically a Scandinavian, since you are relatively close to Greenland? And when Trump talks about seizing the Panama Canal, making Canada the 51st state, sanctions on Colombia, does this all part of what you had predicted? Kind of this cannibalization of allies and this expansionist, like, hey, we're losing in this area, we need to go expansive on this so we can maintain control?
Well, I had not foreseen the efforts to take Greenland, especially not the attempt to seize Canada. For me, this seems a bit wild. I'm not sure if this is more about the domestic audience, because it can't be done. So I think I think he's smart enough to understand this, but he's speaking to different audiences at the same time. So, but the need to increase the U.S. footprint in the Arctic, this is also something that I've written about, because the United States, its Navy, has always been quite important to control the main physical transportation corridors in the world. This has been, the idea ever since Man in the end of the 19th century. This is a key part of being a hegemon. Now, but this happens in the Arctic. You also have a opening up a new route now, which is what the Russians call the Northern Sea Route, which the Chinese have conceptually integrated into the Belt and Road Initiative, or Silk Road, by calling it the Polar Silk Route. And this is being developed now primarily by Russia and China, as well as other countries in the East are joining in. So America would like to counter this. Not only is it becoming a transportation corridor, but there's also a lot of natural resources becoming available. And this is why the US has for many years now, especially under Pompeo, he was very vocal about this. The US will enter the Arctic in a much bigger way, which means that you want to militarize then Scandinavia, which is being done. Finland and Sweden has been brought in across Scandinavia. US military bases will be opened left and right. And if Greenland could go under the control of the United States or a sovereign control, but again, maybe Trump will make a deal with the Danes, just give a lot of base rights, and then he will leave them alone. So they might just give him what he wants anyways through threats. So it's so I think this is the everyone's expecting a great power rivalry in the Arctic, and it's coming. So I think he's just preparing himself.
Yeah, that's really really good insights there, Professor. Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about this technological sovereignty. This is something that in a lot of your work that you've referenced that technological sovereignty and a country's ability to achieve a great power status, or the idea that a country or region must have their own big tech companies, AI industries, et cetera. I think what we're looking at right now, obviously the United States and China, the two biggest rivals, when it comes to AI and tech, very interesting developments, earlier last month with, for example, DeepSeek. I mean, that has completely changed the game, really sent a warning shot to Silicon Valley that, wow, the Chinese are, they're maybe not going to be able to produce the most advanced semiconductors in the world, but they're certainly going to be able to power and use they can do a lot more with less, I think, is the key message here. And, that we certainly shouldn't count against, tech innovation, coming from China. Tell us a little bit more about this theory, with technological sovereignty and how you're looking at, for example, China and their rise, and how that's going to play into geopolitics.
Well, I published a book 4 years ago on this topic. It's called Great Power Politics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it's not based on that radically new ideas. It's just the idea that technological sovereignty is a condition for political sovereignty. Again, this was also from the first industrial revolution. This was already something that became evident. This was also the perspective of Alexander Hamilton in the United States, which led to the American system. This idea that if the US would be completely dependent on the British for manufactured goods, then they would not be able to preserve their political sovereignty. Indeed, this is what they said in the British Parliament as well. If everyone becomes dependent on our manufactured goods, we can effectively rule them as colonies without the having to manage them or govern them. So this is something that not just maybe started in the United States, but also the idea that spread across Europe in the 19th century. The idea that industrial sovereignty or technological sovereignty is intrinsically linked to nation building. But now we're entering a very different time. Right. Again, with the digital technologies, we can see in the past, if you look at who are the biggest companies like General Motors, if you look at the tech companies today, how much more money they have and how much fewer people they hire, right. It's a huge concentration of power. And that's when digital powers were focused primarily on communication. Now, in the fourth industrial revolution, we see countries, the digital technologies being capable of also manipulating the physical world, and the digital companies will now move into industries which belong previously to the physical world. So this is why the people who are making your search platforms are also sending rockets into space. They're building their own currencies. They're going to get into agriculture. Right. They're into smart manufacturing. The self-driving cars. Again, this is so. If you don't adjust to this, you can't have political sovereignty. And a good example are the Germans. Top in car making. This is the big industry, but they fell behind on the digital revolution. And now, of course, everything is going bust. Also because of the energy, of course, that they cut themselves off from the Russians. It doesn't matter if you're the dominant horse carriage producer when the combustion engine comes into play. So, right. And I think this is the position we're in. So this is why the great powers, they recognize that if you're going to remain a great power, you have to have some ecosystem which is independent or autonomous. This is something that the Chinese and Russians are prioritizing. The Chinese obviously are far more dominant and powerful than the Russians, but the Russians have still prioritized to have the technological sovereignty. That is, all the main digital giants in Russia are national companies. They sometimes engage in partnership with others, but they make sure that they have a majority share.
Right.
And this is this is the direction we're going. And the lead for the main technologies is obviously a competition between the US and China.
Right.
And for China, they especially learned this lesson because they used to be, the largest power in the world. Then they fell behind on the first industrial revolution, and suddenly a tiny island state called Britain came over and could crush them in the Opium Wars, and they had a century of humiliation thereafter. So
that's right.
This is because they fell behind on the technologies. So it's not just some business opportunities. This is the fight for who will be the largest powers in the system. It's a competition for survival as well. So it's going to be something. It's going to be very central, I think, to great power politics in the years to come.
Yeah, I really love that insight. I think that's a very, very interesting way to help people understand, why is United States and China constantly investing in tech? Because if you fall behind with technology, you do lose your status. And I kind of want a follow-up question on that, because I think if we look at Europe, Europe is, very much falling behind. Has Europe's lack of a tech industry, really cemented their irrelevance for the future? I mean, is there any path for Europe to creating one, or is it really the future, going to be US and China dominated with other countries like a Russia who's getting that state funding and prioritizing that? How do you look at that specifically for Europe in the future?
No, I think Europe is a tech colony now. That is, it becomes so excessively dependent. There's this funny interview where you actually have Boris Johnson is trying to mock Russia because he's saying, well, look, you don't have proper technological sovereignty. Look at your country. Where's your Amazon? Where's your Google? But they actually have that. Their Google is Yandex. They have Asper. They have all this, their own ecosystem. But and he kept saying, we have this, we have Apple, we have Amazon. It's like, no, we don't. The Americans do. The Americans, they're still in the lead of the game here. The Europeans do not. But we bought into this idea of a political West as if it's one community. But of course, the United States will do what any reasonable power does. It looks after the US first. This is not just a Trumpian slogan. This is how all countries behave. So the Europeans become more and more dependent on the United States. Again, many Europeans feel that they're pressured to follow American foreign policy and sanction policies, because if you use the dollar and the US banks in trade, you have to fall in line. And now it's the same is going to happen with this extrajudicial legislation is going to also be able to be enforced with all digital services, which Europe depends on the United States. And so as you see all these big tech companies eating out more and more of the traditional industries, Europe will only grow more and more dependent on the United States. So I think this is the main source of Europe's decline. It hasn't been able to move beyond its traditional industries and get on the digital wave.
Right.
And of course, by cutting itself off from cheap energy, which is the lifeblood of industry,
right.
It also ensured that this death came much, much faster as well. So the traditional industries are dying, and then they can't transition into anything belonging to the new world. So I think Europe is done.
Definitely. Well, the energy and the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, and I mean, you look at Germany, for example, the industrial powerhouse, the heartbeat of the European economy. I mean, their economy has struggled tremendously after losing that cheap Russian gas, which supplied so many of the factories that built all of this. And I think it's a very interesting one. I mean, it's I focus a lot of my work on China, and I think that was one of China's biggest advantages, was building this entire tech ecosystem that operates within China. But they don't have that foreign interference, from the United States. It's not a Facebook and a Instagram that is dominating the minds of the Chinese. They have their own ecosystem, and you can do that very easily with 1.4 billion people. But I think I want to talk a little bit about the unique thing.
I can just say, I just got back from Beijing. It was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was I was a bit surprised. None of the apps you would have there, you have to. No one you really use that much cash, and credit card is like a checkbook. They don't use that either. So I didn't come properly prepared, because I only had Google and the WhatsApp, and all of this is that doesn't work there. So
that's right.
I came deaf and blind. So everyone is repatriating their supply chains. They are pushing making sure that they don't become too dependent on foreign technologies, especially then of the rivals. So again, that's why the US is also pushing to squeeze out the Chinese techs. On the Chinese side, they're doing the same, but
right.
As you pointed out, the Chinese have a huge advantage because they have the whole ecosystem in place, which is what America is, recognizing now, which is also predictable why the sanctions would fail.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that the difficult thing with trying to sanction and stop China's rise is you have a very large country, one of the most populated in the world. There's 10 times the amount of STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and math in China. I always say, you would never want to bet against the Chinese for figuring out a problem, certainly when it involves tech, engineering, things like that. And like I said earlier, they're very good at doing more with less. I mean, the DeepSeek is the best example we can give where, yes, we don't have the most advanced microchips in the world, but we've processed older microchips to we use more of them, and we process them to do the same computations and actually produce something that's even better. And I mean, and the incredible thing that I know, it's open source, which is really a gift to the world. And I think that's a really great thing that came out, is we see a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and people that not necessarily, pro or anti-China, just like I'm in the tech industry, and what China's created is a gift to the world, and it's a great thing. But I kind of want to follow, this into my next question, which is about the role of the oligarchs in the United States system. This is a really interesting one, because we've seen, when Donald Trump was elected, up on stage, you've got some of the top CEOs in the world, over $1 trillion worth of net worth on that stage, with a Donald Trump. How do the needs of these corporations and oligarchs, balance with the great power politics? I think this is a very interesting phenomenon that we see in the United States when you have the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerbergs. There's a very strategic reason why they're all up on stage there with Trump. Obviously, they want to get close to him and potentially get some, obviously Elon Musk with his SpaceX, and Tesla already received billions in government contracts. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, they all very quickly adjusted to, maybe Mark Zuckerberg was the most interesting one. His the entire physical appearance shifted. So
that's right.
The political winds shifted. So yeah, this was interesting. But I think it's a good way to think of it as the usual way society is divided. You have the state, you have corporations, and then you have the individual. And now, once the Industrial Revolution began to kick through the 19th century, in the beginning, people tended to look for freedom for the individual. They look towards the marketplace, because then they would take some balance off some of the power of the state. But then by the end of the 19th century, the corporations had become so powerful that a lot of the same liberals then began to look towards the state to limit some of the power of corporate power, which is why often when you look at liberals around the world, sometimes they come in different shapes. Some believe that the government have to intervene to balance the oligarchy. Other believes that liberalism means stay away from the market, because the main problem is government. But anyways, the main challenge is what happens when the government and corporations get into bed together, if you will. And this is then you begin to border towards more the political economy of fascism. This is can be problematic, because then the individual would be very much marginalized, especially if it's mixed with militarism and excessive nationalism, but anyways, I think that the problem is how do you solve this? Because on one hand, in the past, one could break up the main giants. That is, if you have a large corporation like an oil company, you can break it into smaller ones to make sure that they don't get too much market power.
Right.
On the other hand, in this very global economy, you need large corporations to be competitive in international markets. So what do? You don't want them so big that they can begin to interfere and dictate domestic politics, but you want them big enough to compete against others. Right. And if this is a problem with, again, this is the logic why countries also build these large oil and gas giants, because they're able to compete. But it becomes even more complicated in the tech industry, I guess, because the concentration is part of the good synergy effect effects. I mean, this is why I think Elon Musk wants X to become something like WeChat, one app for everything. Effectively, this is your payment system, a digital currency. You can use it for emailing, making calls, posting videos, and just a bit of everything. Hailing cabs. Right. So if you break them down, then you're not going to be able to compete in the international system either. But what do? Does the government take control of the corporations? Do the corporations take control over the government? It's not. There's no really good solutions to this, I guess. A common one is just to create these national giants and keep them at an arm's length, and make sure that the corporations are aligned with political, with national interest.
Right.
The problem is if you have political polarization, which is also something that happens when the economy becomes exhausted, too much economic inequality, many reasons why, then of course these tech corporations can be used as instruments not just against foreign powers but also against each other. And I think that is the political opposition, and I think this is something we've been seeing more of, especially in the United States, and I think more will come. That is the Republicans were complaining that Twitter was censoring them. Now the Democrats are complaining after Musk took it over. Now it's a tool of Trump.
Right.
They're probably not wrong either. And I forgot, there was an important app which came up during Twitter's period. I forgot what it was. Trump used it for a while. Anyways,
is it the social, like Truth Social? Was it the one that Donald Trump?
Before Truth Social, there was 4 letters. Anyways, it was taken down, and Amazon denied its server space.
Okay.
I think it was Google didn't want to put it on the app. I can't remember the name anymore. It disappeared in, I think, around 2018.
Okay.
Anyways, I think you will see more of this. So it's a problem. It should be addressed because there's no easy solutions to it.
Well, Professor, I want to ask one final question, and it's more of a broader question here. As you are a fantastic professor, one of the best European geopolitical experts, and I want to just get your thoughts as we continue moving forward in 2025. What do you want people to really understand about geopolitics in the future? As we're trying to understand all of these complex situations, the war between Russia, Ukraine, the tech rivalry between the United States and China, the Taiwan issue being a very, very much worldwide affair because of all those semiconductors that are there, the decline of Europe, this Monroe Doctrine. I mean, there's so many things happening around the globe. How do people understand this better? What is the one thing that they need to understand to really understand geopolitics moving forward? What would their message be to people?
Well, I think a bit related to what we started talking about, which is I think we're living in a very interesting period of time when the world is transitioning from unipolarity to multipolarity, because I don't think people always appreciate what unipolarity actually meant, because the point of departure in security studies, or if you want to enhance your security, has always been the security competition. That is, if you want to have security, you also have to make sure that your adversaries don't feel threatened either, because if country A enhances its security, it undermines the security of country B. So it's always been common sense that you want to find solution for indivisible security, because if you have regions like Europe, if one doesn't have security, then effectively no one will, because then the security competition kicks in. Now, the problem we had under unipolarity is this was the official policy there shouldn't be any mitigation of the security competition. Just security means one side dominates completely. This is also why we cut ourselves off from many opportunities to make, for example, peace with China or Russia. If you look at China, I actually think it's a good idea, some of these industrial policies of Trump. I think the United States should make sure it has technological sovereignty. It should be competitive. But I think it takes it one step too far when it's linked into the idea of global primacy. Because if you have to break the Chinese, then a lot of these efforts become excessive, then one has to not just increase the US ability, but also sabotage the Chinese. And I think that's where it gets into trouble, same as the Russians. The Russians, we have to keep in mind that what the Russians wanted in Europe after the Cold War, they just wanted to get as close as possible with the West. They want to integrate into common Europe. And but again, under unipolarity, this doesn't work. So they have to be undermined. So this is why we began to create a Europe without the Russians. This is why we have revived bloc politics, expanded up to their borders. So really, the Russian security demands weren't that extreme. They simply said, you can't roll up your military up to our borders in order to make sure that we stay weak and irrelevant. And this is as if China would roll up its military all the way up on the Mexican border to the United States, just to make sure that the US will be completely contained and not play a significant role in international affairs. It would be unacceptable. Correct. But this is what you have to do if you want to be a global hegemon. So we cut ourselves off from workable peace, solutions which could work. But in order to pursue some of this, one has to give up on the idea that security has to derive from global primacy. And even if you look at the discourse around security these days, I mean, it's quite absurd. If you want to mitigate security competition, you have to recognize the security concern of your adversary and then find out how you can both pursue positive some security. We're not even allowed anymore to discuss the security concerns of adversaries. You don't see in the media anymore. What is the Chinese worried about? What are the Russians worried about? We can't do this. Then one can be accused of legitimizing them or taking their side. So, but if you only look at one side of this problem, how do they threaten us, but not how we threaten them? You're going to come up with very extreme solutions. Well, I guess we have to defeat them. Everyone is suddenly a Hitler. Negotiation is appeasement, and the only way you can have peace is through military victory. So, I think if you want to see why we become so extreme over the past years, and I do think we have become very radical, it really goes back to this core that we reject the whole principle of mitigating security competition, and instead we go for full dominance. This is the only only acceptable security strategy, because we think this is the only way that liberal democracy can survive. It's extremely dangerous, and I think that's taken us down a very dangerous path. And we really need political leaders who has some political imagination to envision something else. And that's actually not even my thought. This was the idea of George Kennan. He was the great American diplomat who thought of these containment policies against the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, he was upset because they were able to bring the Cold War to an end, to have peace, and then he was complaining why there's no political imagination behind the leaders to create a different system, instead of just talking about reviving bloc politics. Who should be in the bloc, who should be left out? Why are we doing this? This is not how security is enhanced. Especially when our main rival wanted to be our closest ally. It's beyond absurd. So here we are. And I think if we take a step back and look at the international system and the world order that was created after the Cold War, a lot of the conflicts we have become quite predictable, but also the solutions suddenly begin to present themselves instead of being faced with Hitler's left and right. So I think we have to take a step back and reconsider some of the things we've done over the past 30 years.
That's fantastic. Professor Diesen, I want to thank you for your very rational, common sense approach and just really breaking that down for all of us today. I know that George Kennan, for example, was one of America's greatest minds. Obviously, I believe he was the diplomat, toured the Soviet Union, spent a lot of time working on Russia or Soviet Union. Soviet Union and United States relations. But I remember in a New York Times open ed, I think he had actually said the expansion of NATO would be just a disaster. I mean, this was back in the 90s that he had said that. So, again, it's when you look back at the history and you see these early warning signs, again, I think the United States really dropped the ball with, Russia wanting to have that bigger role. As soon as the Soviet Union fell, it's like, hey, we want to be closer to Europe. Can we be part of the EU? Can we get closer to the United States? How do we work together with you? And largely it was rejected. I mean, it was just saying, no, basically you're still our enemy. We still, the Cold War is over, but you're still our enemy. We don't want Russia to succeed. And I think, this is a really important point that you mentioned, is the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, something we talk often about this channel, because this is a different world that we are living in right now. And it's important to have guests like yourself that are speaking the truth and advocating for change and this political creativity that you just mentioned. I really like that. I do hope that we can certainly have more politicians that shift towards that thinking and find a way that we can all work together. I mean, we only have one planet to live on, and we need to respect everybody's security concerns and figure out a way to work together. And again, I just want to say thank you for your work and thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Can I just have one final comment, sir?
Absolutely.
Because the article you cited with George Kennan, it was an interview, Friedman interviewed George Kennan in an article, New York Times in 1998. And I would advise all your listeners to actually read this article, because this is how common sense used to be permitted. In George Kennan himself, he predicted as well. He said, why are we doing this? Why are we expanding a military alliance when no one was threatening anyone? He said founding fathers will be turning in their graves. And he also made a prediction. He said, if we do this at some point, it's because it's so provocative. At some point, the Russians will begin to push back, and when they do, all the NATO expanders will say, "Oh, look, the Russians are aggressive. It's like in their DNA." And he made the point: this is wrong. This is just natural. If you don't take into account their security and you expand a military alliance towards the border, we will revive conflicts. Right. No one says this anymore, but in the 90s, many American leaders did. So it's worth to revisit some of these things if you want to see where it went wrong. Anyway, sorry for the...
No, I'm glad you added that. I mean, because I've actually included that in a previous video that I've made. Actually, we'll link the links to that video and also the article that New York Times with Thomas Friedman and George Kennan. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And I mean, that's why we study history, because when you, like you said, a lot of this is like, well, this could have been predicted. We've seen this, what happened after the Cold War, that sets off a chain reaction. I mean, it's very similar to the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, this didn't start in 2022. It started back in 2014. There's a lot of events that happened before that. Unfortunately, in Western media, it's only presented one way. Well, this is a conflict that happened 3 years ago. That's the timeline. But actually, the seeds of this really go back to the fall of the Soviet Union, and you need to really understand the much broader picture here. And obviously, I know you're a very studied Russian history and very knowledgeable about that. So that's again why we want to get your voice out there and get your political ideas out there, because I think you're promoting an idea that we need to find a way to work together and solve these conflicts. And like you said, not turn everybody into a Hitler that needs to be defeated, or that military expansion and missiles equal peace. No, doesn't equal peace at all. We need some return to some common sense and better diplomacy, which you had mentioned as well. That diplomacy has not been used in these conflicts, but we need to return to that very desperately.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, sir.
We'll end there. Professor Diesen, thank you for your time. Everybody, I'm going to make sure that you also follow him on YouTube and Twitter. Fantastic follow, really, if you're interested in the best geopolitical insights, certainly from Europe. We're going to put all those links down below. And thank you, everybody, for your continued support. We can see you all in our next video soon.